He was a priest, a son, and a servant of the Lord, and he watched everything he knew come to a violent end in a single afternoon. His story is not told at length in popular teaching, but it runs quietly through the pages of Samuel and Kings. He served David from the wilderness to the throne room. He carried the ephod when there was no other priest to do so. And in the end, he was removed from the priesthood by a king's command, fulfilling a prophecy spoken before his birth. That is the story of Abiathar. To understand Abiathar, you have to understand what happened at Nob. Nob was a priestly city. It is described in Scripture as the city of the priests, and it was located near Jerusalem, though its exact position is not given with precision in the text. At the time of this account, it was home to a community of priests descended from Eli, the high priest who had served at Shiloh. Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, served as high priest there, and his son Abiathar lived among the priests of that city. This was a place of religious life, of sacred service, of worship and intercession. It was not a place of war. David arrived at Nob alone and in flight. He had left the court of Saul in a hurry, fleeing for his life. Saul's jealousy and fear had turned into active hostility, and David had no army, no supplies, and no clear path forward. He came to Ahimelech seeking bread and a weapon. Ahimelech was troubled when he saw David arrive without companions. He asked why David was alone. David told him he was on a mission from the king and that his men were meeting him elsewhere. The Bible records this exchange without further explanation, and this moment has been the subject of serious theological reflection for a long time. Ahimelech gave David the showbread, the consecrated bread removed from the table of the Lord, and the sword of Goliath, which had been kept wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. These were significant provisions. The showbread was sacred. Its use for David rests on the understanding that the need was genuine, and the man who received it was in right standing before God. The priest served the man he believed was still in good standing with King Saul. He had no reason to suspect otherwise. But someone was watching. The Scripture tells us plainly that Doeg the Edomite was there that day. He is described as the chief of Saul's herdsmen, a man who had been detained before the Lord. What he was doing there, and what the nature of his detention involved, the Bible does not specify. What matters is what he did with what he saw. He observed what Ahimelech did for David. He saw the bread, he saw the sword, and he carried that information back to Saul. When Saul assembled his servants and accused them of conspiracy with David, it was Doeg who stepped forward. He reported what he had witnessed at Nob, the inquiry, the provision, the sword of Goliath. Saul summoned Ahimelech and all the priests of his father's house. Ahimelech came before the king and gave a measured and honest response. He pointed to David's faithful service and his honorable standing. He said he did not know David was fleeing from anyone. The defense was reasonable. It was also true. Ahimelech had no reason to suspect David was a fugitive. But Saul was not looking for facts. He had made up his mind, and Ahimelech's honesty could not change what was coming. Saul did not accept the defense. He ordered his servants to kill the priests of the Lord. But the servants refused. They would not raise their hands against the priests of God. Saul then turned to Doeg and gave the order. Doeg carried it out. The Scripture records that on that day, Doeg killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He then went to Nob and struck the city with the sword, killing men and women and children and infants and animals. It was complete destruction. Among all the sons of Ahimelech, one survived. Abiathar escaped. The Bible does not tell us how he escaped, what direction he ran, or what he witnessed before he fled. Scripture does not provide details about the precise circumstances of his survival. What the text tells us is the outcome. He escaped and fled after David. He was the only one who got away. Think about the weight of that. He walked away from Nob, carrying the loss of every person he had grown up with, every priest he had known, every familiar face in the community that had formed him. He had nothing except what he had carried out with him. When Abiathar found David and told him what happened at Nob, David's response is recorded with striking directness. David said he had known, on the day he saw Doeg there, that Doeg would surely tell Saul. He acknowledged that he had brought about the death of all the persons of Ahimelech's house. Then he told Abiathar to stay with him. He said that whoever sought Abiathar's life was also seeking his own, and that Abiathar would be kept safe with him. David did not minimize what happened. He named his own role in it plainly, and he made a concrete commitment to the surviving priest who had nowhere else to go. Abiathar, the last priest of Nob, was now sheltered with David in the wilderness. If this kind of careful look at the people and events of biblical history is something you want to continue exploring, consider subscribing. There is more to come in this series. Abiathar brought the ephod with him when he fled to David. This detail is mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 23, and it carries real theological weight. The ephod in this context is the priestly garment associated with the Urim and Thummim, the sacred instruments used for seeking the Lord's guidance. With the ephod present and with Abiathar functioning as a priest, David now had the means to inquire of the Lord formally and through legitimate priestly channels. This becomes immediately relevant. When David was at Keilah and heard that the Philistines were attacking and plundering the threshing floors, he inquired of the Lord whether he should go and strike them. The Lord said yes. David's men were afraid of the prospect, and David inquired again to confirm. The Lord affirmed the direction. David went, fought the Philistines, and saved the inhabitants of Keilah. The presence of Abiathar and the ephod made this formal consultation possible in a context where no temple, no tabernacle, and no established sanctuary was easily accessible. When David later inquired whether Saul would come down after him and whether the men of Keilah would surrender him, the Lord answered both questions with specificity. Saul would come. The city would hand him over. David left before either thing could happen. He received an answer and acted on it. This is the pattern that characterizes David's wilderness years. He asks, he listens, he responds to what he receives. The Bible does not give us a comprehensive account of every inquiry David made through Abiathar during these years. It is possible there were other consultations not recorded in detail. What the text makes clear is that the presence of the ephod was not ceremonial. It represented the continuation of covenantal worship and formal priestly access to God even after the destruction of Nob. Consider what that means in practical terms. A community of priests was killed. The city of Nob was struck with the sword. And yet, the means of seeking the Lord's direction was not lost. One man carried the ephod away when he fled. Abiathar's role in these years was not simply to carry an object. He remained a priest and continued serving the Lord, now in exile, in uncertain conditions. He had lost his father, his entire community, the priestly city that had been the center of his religious world. He was living as a fugitive alongside another man who was also being hunted. The scripture does not give us any window into what this cost him personally. There are no recorded laments, no petitions we can point to. What the text gives us instead is the continuing record of the work. Inquiry was made, the Lord answered. The connection between Israel's God and Israel's anointed king held through those wilderness years, and Abiathar was part of making that possible. That is sometimes all we know about faithful people. Not what they felt, not what it cost them, only what they did, and that it mattered. There is a kind of faithfulness that works without recognition. It does not appear at the front of the procession. It does not hold a title that anyone outside the inner circle would know. It shows up in difficult places, does the necessary work, and asks nothing in return except the chance to keep serving. That is what Abiathar did in the wilderness years. And it is worth noting carefully, because this kind of service is often noticed only when it is no longer there. Abiathar remained with David throughout the years of exile and throughout the long arc of his reign. The wilderness period lasted years and was genuinely dangerous. David's company grew in size and complexity, and eventually David was anointed king of Judah and then king over all Israel. Through every one of those transitions, Abiathar was present. That continuity across such different seasons of a man's life is not something to pass over quickly. By the time David had established Jerusalem as his capital, Abiathar is listed alongside Zadok as one of the priests serving before the king. The books of Samuel name both men in lists of those who served under David. Zadok was from the line of Eleazar, one of Aaron's sons. Abiathar was from the line of Ithamar through Eli. Both lines descended from Aaron, but they were distinct branches. The simultaneous service of Zadok and Abiathar reflected the presence of both priestly lines during David's reign. Scripture does not comment on how this arrangement worked in practice, but it held throughout David's reign. No recorded tension. Both men present. Both men serving. There is something quietly significant about that arrangement lasting as long as it did. The man who came out of the wilderness with nothing but the ephod eventually stood beside another priest from a different line, serving before the king. Together, they carried out the priestly duties in Israel for many years. His survival at Nob had not been the end of a story. It had been the beginning of a life that would later serve close to the king and at the heart of Israel's worship. One of the most visible tests of Abiathar's loyalty came during Absalom's rebellion. When Absalom rose against his father and David was forced to leave Jerusalem on foot, the priests went with him. Zadok, Abiathar, and the Levites brought the ark of God out of the city. But David instructed Zadok to return the ark to Jerusalem. His reasoning was plain and, in its way, remarkable. If the Lord was pleased with him, the Lord would bring him back to the ark. If the Lord had no delight in him, then the outcome would be what it would be. He was placing the ark back in Jerusalem and walking into the wilderness, not knowing how the story would end. David also made a specific arrangement with both priests before they returned to the city. He asked them to send him word through their sons, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, about anything they heard in Jerusalem. They agreed and served as David's intelligence within the city during the rebellion. The messages were carried at considerable personal risk, and what reached David helped him navigate the crisis and decide when and where to move. Zadok and Abiathar fulfilled that trust faithfully. Absalom's rebellion eventually collapsed, and David returned to Jerusalem. What this period tells us about Abiathar is simply this: he was with David before David had power, and he was with him when that power was most seriously threatened. That is a long record, and it is a faithful one. It is also, in the end, a record that includes a single decision that undid the standing he had built across all of those years. Something about the shape of that record is worth holding in mind. Abiathar did not serve David because David was powerful. He came to David when David had nothing, no army, no city, no certainty of survival. He came because there was nowhere else to go, and because the God he served had placed him alongside the man he would serve for the rest of his working life. He stayed through everything that followed. But loyalty and discernment are not the same thing. A person can remain committed to someone across decades of genuine hardship and still misread a critical moment near the end. Loyalty is measured over time. Discernment is tested in the present. Abiathar had the first in abundance. What comes next is where the second failed him. David was old. The opening verses of 1 Kings chapter 1 describe him as very old, unable to keep warm even with many coverings. His physical decline was visible to those around him, and everyone close to the throne understood that the question of succession was pressing. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, was one of David's sons. The text describes him as a man of impressive appearance and notes that his father had never rebuked him or questioned his behavior. He began to exalt himself, acquiring chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. The comparison to Absalom is implicit in the text, but clear. He was positioning himself to be king before he had been made king. Adonijah held a feast at the stone of Zoheleth near En-Rogel. He invited his brothers, the royal officials of Judah, and Joab the son of Zeruiah, the commander of David's army. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the mighty men, or Solomon. The deliberate exclusion of Solomon is significant. It suggests that Adonijah understood exactly who represented a rival claim and who would not support what he was attempting. Among those who came to support Adonijah was Abiathar the priest. The text names him plainly. His presence gave Adonijah's movement religious legitimacy it would not otherwise have carried. Joab's military support and Abiathar's priestly support together made the bid look substantial. On the other side, Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, Solomon. The two sides were clearly defined, and Abiathar was on the wrong one. Scripture does not tell us his reasoning. We are not given access to his thinking. It is possible he considered Adonijah's position among David's sons to be significant. It is possible his long relationship with Joab shaped his decision. It is possible he had reservations about the circle around Solomon. The text does not say, and any detailed account of his motivations would be speculation. What can be said is this: a man who had spent his entire adult life alongside David, who had seen God answer inquiry after inquiry through the ephod, who had been present through enough of the record to understand that Solomon was the intended successor. That man made a choice that placed him against the direction God had already made clear. Whatever his reasons, that is what the record shows. When Nathan the prophet learned of Adonijah's feast, he moved quickly. He went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and told her what had happened, that Adonijah had made himself king without David's knowledge. He instructed her to go to David and ask why Adonijah had become king when David had promised the throne to Solomon. Nathan said he would follow and confirm what she said. Bathsheba went to David and spoke to him. David listened, then gave his oath again that Solomon would be king after him and would sit on his throne that very day. He called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and gave them clear instructions. Zadok and Nathan were to anoint Solomon as king at the spring of Gihon without delay. They carried out the instructions immediately. Solomon was anointed. The people rejoiced loudly, and the sound of the celebration reached Adonijah's feast before any messenger arrived. Jonathan the son of Abiathar came with the news. He reported that David had made Solomon king and that Solomon was already seated on the royal throne. The guests scattered. Adonijah fled to the altar and took hold of its horns, seeking sanctuary. Solomon's initial response was restrained. He told Adonijah to go home. The immediate crisis passed without violence, but where power rested was now unmistakable to everyone involved. After David's death, Adonijah made a request that the text of 1 Kings chapter 2 treats as politically loaded. He asked Bathsheba to approach Solomon on his behalf and request that Abishag the Shunammite, who had cared for David in his final days, be given to him as a wife. Solomon heard this and responded with anger. Solomon moved decisively. He ordered Benaiah to put Adonijah to death. Joab, who had also fled to the altar when events turned against him, was struck down. And then Solomon turned to Abiathar. Solomon said directly that Abiathar deserved to die, but he would not put him to death at that time, because he had carried the ark of the Lord before David and had shared in all his hardships. Solomon removed Abiathar from his priestly office and sent him to Anathoth, to his own fields. The verdict is worth reading carefully. Abiathar was not executed. He lost his priestly position, his place in the religious life of the nation, his standing as a functioning priest. But he kept his life. And the reason Solomon gave for that mercy was specific. The years of suffering with David counted for something. That record, the wilderness, the hardship, the cost, was spoken aloud inside the verdict against him. It was not sufficient to cancel the consequence, but it was enough to be named. The text of 1 Kings then draws a direct theological connection. It states that what Solomon did in removing Abiathar fulfilled the word the Lord had spoken to Eli at Shiloh concerning his house. This is a reference to the oracle in 1 Samuel chapter 2, where a man of God came to Eli and delivered a word of judgment. The oracle declared that the days were coming when the Lord would cut off the strength of Eli's house, and that there would no longer be an old man in Eli's priestly line. The faithfulness that God had promised would pass to another priestly line. Abiathar was from that line, a descendant of Eli from the branch of Aaron through Ithamar. The oracle had been spoken before Abiathar was born. It had been delivered because of the sins of Eli's sons at Shiloh, and Eli's failure to restrain them, their contempt for the Lord's offerings, and his unwillingness to remove them from their priestly duties. The consequences of those failures had moved forward through the generations, unchanged by the generations of faithful service that followed, until they arrived here. In the words of a new king, in the dismissal of one elderly priest to a field outside the city. This is one of those places in Scripture where the weight of what is being described exceeds what a brief summary can carry. A judgment spoken across generations. A man who lived faithfully for decades and still arrived at the moment the prophecy required. His personal choice and the larger divine purpose reaching the same outcome through different paths. Scripture does not smooth this over or explain it away. It simply states the fulfillment, and it is worth sitting with that without rushing to resolve it. The text does not present Abiathar as bearing no personal responsibility for what happened. His decision to support Adonijah was a real decision with real consequences. But the text also frames his removal as the completion of a word spoken long before his birth. Both realities are present in the account at the same time. His personal action and the larger divine purpose are not in competition in the narrative. They are simply both there. After Abiathar's removal, the line of Zadok continued. The dual priestly structure that had held throughout David's reign came to an end. One line went forward, the other was set aside. Abiathar went to Anathoth. After his removal to Anathoth, Scripture does not record any further events from his life. He steps out of the narrative and does not return. One further note: the town of Anathoth, where Abiathar was sent, is the same town named in the opening verse of the book of Jeremiah as the home of Jeremiah's priestly family. Jeremiah is described as the son of Hilkiah, of the priests at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. Whether a direct family connection existed between Abiathar's line and Jeremiah's priestly ancestry is something Scripture does not specify. But the association between Anathoth and a priestly family connected to the house of Eli has long been noted by careful students of the text. If the connection holds, then the priestly line removed from official service in Solomon's day may have produced, in a later generation, one of the most searching prophetic voices in Israel's entire history. The story of Abiathar does not resolve neatly. It carries more than one truth at the same time. And the honest response is to hold those truths together rather than reduce the account to a single lesson. What the account offers is not a formula for faithful service. It is a record of what faithful service actually looks like across a whole life. Its obscure beginnings, its demanding middle years, and the way it can be complicated by a single decision made near the end. His survival at Nob was not heroic in any conventional sense. He ran. But his running preserved something Israel needed: a functioning priest, the means of formal inquiry, the continuation of covenantal access to God during years when David had no established sanctuary. The Lord preserved one man from the destruction of an entire priestly city, and that man served faithfully in the wilderness for years before anyone built him a role commensurate with his labor. That kind of obscure, structural faithfulness is easy to overlook. But it is the kind that holds things together precisely when the institutions have collapsed and the formal arrangements no longer apply. There is a kind of service that does not wait for favorable conditions. It does not require a sanctuary, a title, or a recognized position in the community. It requires only the willingness to do what the moment demands, to carry what can be carried, to ask what must be asked, to remain where remaining is costly. Abiathar did this during the years in the wilderness. That is worth more than a passing mention. Then there is the matter of his final choice. At the end of a long life of recognized service, Abiathar aligned himself with Adonijah. The record does not tell us why. What it shows is that long experience in service does not insulate a person from significant error in judgment. Abiathar had been present through every major season of David's reign: the wilderness, the kingdom, the rebellion, the restoration. He had seen how God directed events across decades. And then, at the end, he read the succession wrongly and paid for it with everything he had built. We do not reach a place in our service where accumulated faithfulness makes our current judgment immune from scrutiny. A long record is a genuine good. Solomon named it in the sentencing. But faithfulness in the past does not transfer automatically into discernment in the present. Discernment has to be sought fresh in each new moment, particularly the high-stakes ones. The person who has served longest is not exempt from this requirement. They may, in some ways, face a sharper version of it, because they are more likely to trust their own sense of how things stand, rather than to examine that sense carefully before acting. The theological weight of Abiathar's removal rests on more than his political mistake. First Kings states plainly that his dismissal fulfilled the prophetic words spoken to Eli at Shiloh. Abiathar's own choice and the completion of a long-standing divine purpose arrived at the same outcome through different routes. Both are present in the text. Scripture does not resolve the tension between them or offer a formula explaining how human responsibility and divine purpose relate to each other in a case like this. It presents both as real and leaves them together. The mercy shown to Abiathar in the verdict is also worth noting. He was not executed. He was sent away. Solomon spoke the severity of the judgment and then tempered it with a specific reason. The years of suffering with David counted for something. The record of faithfulness was not sufficient to cancel the consequence, but it was sufficient to shape it. That is not a small thing. The long work of faithful people, even those who stumble near the end, is not invisible to the God they served. Abiathar's life runs from one moment of complete loss to another. Between them, is a decades-long record of genuine service that neither the Scripture nor Solomon dismisses. He carried the ephod out of Nob when he fled. He made it possible for David to seek the Lord's direction across years of uncertainty. He stood beside the king through exile, coronation, and crisis. And then, in the final season of a long life, he chose the wrong side of a question that could not be walked back from. The grief at Nob was real. The service in the wilderness was real. The decades of faithful presence were real. The error at the end was real. The prophetic word that his removal fulfilled was real. None of it cancels any other part of it. What his story resists is reduction. It cannot be made into a simple lesson about loyalty, or a cautionary note about political misjudgment, or a clean illustration of how God's sovereignty operates through human failure. It is all of those things at once, and the weight of it depends on holding them together. The purposes of God move through imperfect people across long stretches of time. They do not require that every instrument be free from failure. They require only that the work be done, that the inquiry be made, that the priest show up in the wilderness with the ephod and ask. Abiathar did that. For most of his life, in conditions that made the work genuinely hard, he did exactly that. And when the account of his life is closed, in a field outside Jerusalem, in a silence the Scripture does not disturb, what remains is not a verdict on his worth. It is the record of what he carried and how far he carried it.